What if one number could help you add days to your life and not just live longer, but live better? Mikkel Kristiansen, CEO of Ventriject, joins us to explore why VO2 max is more than just a fitness stat. It's a powerful, evidence-based indicator of future health. In this conversation, we explore how small changes to your VO2 max lead to significant improvements in your longevity, and how Ventriject is finally making it accessible, affordable, and scalable. For companies shaping the future of health, this is a huge opportunity to expand your service, prove your value with tangible, usable data that your customers can actually act on. There's no quick fix for health, but there is a smarter, more collaborative path forward. Let's connect the dots. Okay, welcome. I'm so excited to get started today with Mikkel Kristiansen, CEO of Ventriject. We're going to talk about VO2 max and longevity. So welcome, Mikkel. Can you connect the dots between where you started and where you are today? How did VO2 max VO2 max become a central focus in your work?
Yeah, sure, definitely, and great to be here, Jennifer, right? So maybe first of all, background on myself. So I come with a background in medical devices. So I spent a little bit more than a decade working within hearing aids. But I think there's sort of a red line between sort of what I've done over the years is really how can we make sort of technology and make technology much more accessible and basically enabling people to live life to their fullest. Right, so I did that with hearing aids, and now we're trying to do that as well with VO2 max. And how that came across is we originally a spin out of one of the Danish universities. So some much more clever people than I actually developed sort of that really sort of the key technology, researching in something called seismocardiography, which is basically small movements in the chest caused by the beating heart. And with that, we can actually go in and see a really sort of detailed expression of the strength of your heart. And that, together with an algorithm, can then deliver your VO2 max. So we have a very innovative solution that we're now sort of bringing out to the market, which is really cool to see sort of what technology can do to really enable people to take action on their own health.
That's so cool. Like, how did you make that jump between, being able to see how the heart is moving to that connection of maybe we can calculate VO2 max?
So there is generally sort of a good understanding that your VO2 max is to a large extent down to the strength of your heart. Studies have shown that there's elements on with the size of the heart and the strength of the heart is really sort of some of the things that you train when you train your VO2 max. So what we saw is that when with people that sort of have sort of larger something called the diastolic, means how strongly the heart pumps blood into the body, right? The stronger that is, the harder, the higher the VO2 max. So we saw a really strong correlation there, and then build an algorithm to take that reading and then calculate the VO2 max.
Very cool, because as we spoke about right before we hit record, most people haven't ever done their VO2 max test.
No, to be honest, I never did my VO2 max before starting with this business, right? And most people I talk to don't have a really good understanding of it. Of course, it's getting more and more familiarized, right? But very few people have actually done sort of that through VO2 max testing, which is called the CPAT, which is that sort of stress test on the bike with the mask on. It's not really been used by a lot of people. It's much more of an elite thing or sort of elite sports. Executives that is doing things like that, but regular people like you and I have never done it.
Yeah, and it probably starts with the terminology, right? Like VO2 max isn't really a human term. It's not something that you're throwing around in daily vocabulary. But so why is it important? So what's the link between Healthspan, lifespan?
And that's really interesting, right? So if you go back in time, VO2 max was known in many years when it comes to sport and fitness, right? How can we improve the performance of our athletes? And then what we've seen over the last, I think, 10, 15 years is the research and the studies when it comes to VO2 max and health has been sort of booming to an extent that sort of American Heart Association went out a few years ago and actually stating that looking across all of these sort of studies they've done, VO2 max is by far the greatest predictor of mortality and it beats any other parameter that's out there. And you should actually get it assessed every year because it's such an important indicator for your health. So when you talk about sort of lifespan, VO2 max is really sort of a key indicator for how long you will live, and improvements to your VO2 max can extend your life. So there was a Danish study a few years ago that looked at it sort of as a rule of thumb. If you improve your VO2 max by one, your life will actually increase by 45 days. So it's putting it off
Wow.
sort of in the extremes, but still there's an element of the fact that if you improve your VO2 max, you will live longer.
I mean, but that's really specific, right? Like you have something to work for. Can you imagine that dashboard?
So now I live 45 days longer, right? Or
Plus 45. Don't get hit by that bus.
exactly. But what I like more about VO2 max is that element of the health span, right? So we already live quite long lives. So in my own life, I don't necessarily want to necessarily live to 100, but I want to make sure that the life I live is much more healthy, right? And I don't sort of become sick for the last 10 or 20 years of my life. And that's what we refer to as this health span, right? Being healthier for longer and sort of reducing the time between sort of health span and lifespan. And that's where there's even a stronger sort of link with VO2 max, right? Because if you improve your VO2 max and a better VO2 max will show you significant lower risk of developing certain diseases. So there's, as an example, a very strong correlation between your cardiovascular health and your VO2 max, right? Again, a very concrete example is if you improve your VO2 max just slightly, roughly between sort of 3 to 6 VO2 max points,
Hmm.
that would actually reduce your risk of sort of adverse cardiovascular events by 10 to 30%. So there's really sort of really strong links between sort of just improving it slightly will actually reduce your risk significantly and you can thereby live longer. So that's what I really love about VO2 max. One thing is it's a key indicator for health, but also the fact that actually small improvements of it can actually mean a significant impact to your health. So it's not something that you're just born with and you have to deal with it, but you
Hmm.
can change and you can improve. And even small improvements can make a massive impact.
I think what I love about that is that there's so many concrete correlations, and you can't say that with many things. There's a whole lot of speculations in terms of certain actions and what it could impact. But what's really lovely about this is you're giving me very concrete examples of why it's important. What I read on your website, and this surprised me, was it's not just cardiovascular diseases that you're preventing, but VO2 max is linked to preventing or improving your chances of not having other diseases. Can you talk a little bit about those and what they are?
Yeah, so there's actually there's a growing evidence that there is a really strong link between VO2 max and a lot of things, right? So there's a link between VO2 max and your risk of developing certain cancer forms. Right. So for men, there's really strong correlation into prostate cancer, but also colon cancer. For women, there's also really strong link into to breast cancer. But also for general thing, there's also a link into your risk of depression. So there are really sort of a growing number of sort of evidences out there that really talk to the fact that you should sort of focus much more on your VO2 max. And the neat thing about it is there's no sort of it doesn't stop at any point, right? You can always improve and you can always the impact on your health always come there. But there's also an element of I don't need someone to go from being sort of a couch potato to run a marathon. That's not necessarily what I want. But doing small things that you didn't do before can actually mean a significant impact to your health. So just taking the stairs instead of sitting on the couch and taking the elevator all the time, right? Taking longer walks and doing a small run, that's great because you actually, with that, you can significantly improve your health.
Yes, it's turning the dial incrementally and seeing the impact of turning the dial incrementally. I think that's the like and the whole reinforcement of behavior change that's so important that it's like I need to take a walk but it won't matter if you can actually show that it does matter and measure that and see that I get 45 more days because I took the walk. I mean that's really really powerful. Yeah, so you can improve VO2 max as long as you live. And
Yes.
it's important at all stages of your life?
Yes, but it's easier to have a high VO2 max when you're younger, right? So there's a general thing that when sort of with age, your VO2 max will sort of slightly drop, right? And it actually also drops higher when you're sort of beyond 40. Then the
Hmm.
steep curve actually increases a bit. So it's even more important so when you grow older. But you can also sort of preempt things, right? Sort of so the quicker you start, the better. But there's not ever a time where you're saying, okay, it's too late and I should just stop, but you can always do something, right? There's also generally where you see there's a difference between sort of men and women, right? Women typically have a slightly lower VO2 max, but it doesn't really change the fundamentals of it, the fact that you can improve your VO2 max and VO2 max always is relevant for you.
Okay. And like, is there any difference in reason for focusing on VO2 max between women and men? Does it have different health outcomes?
Not really. It's still really important for both genders. And of course, there are some sicknesses, right? So breast cancer for women, prostate cancer for men, but generally, when you're looking at across the studies that have been done, it is a really strong indicator for health for both genders. So it's important for both genders to take action on it.
And just reinforcing it's more important later in life to stay on top of it and measure it, right? That's where
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
and like we were talking again in the beginning about like VO2 max not being a particularly accessible term, and it's hard to find a place if you're not going to the doctor for a stress test and you're not an athlete. Most people haven't had a VO2 max test. So that means that most people actually don't know what the experience of a VO2 max test is. Can you walk us through, like, because now we're about to do A B scenario. A was the original option, and then I'll set you up for Ventriject.
No, so yeah, so you say the best way of assessing VO2 max or sort of the gold standard in VO2 max testing is this stress test, which is on a bike or a treadmill with sort of a mask on. You have to you go to maximal exertion. It's really not necessarily a very pleasant way of doing it. It provides a lot of detail, but it is also a very sort of impractical and expensive way of doing it. It's not really that accessible, and you see it most likely being offered to sort of athlete or executives or sort of very in a sort of very hospital setting, right? So it's not something that you'll get in a sort of regular doctor's appointment or wherever you go to a sort of a health clinic or in your gym. It is really something that is really expensive, but also sort of in a niche ground, right? And then you have other ways of assessing your VO2 max on as well, which is there's sport watches out there that will give a good estimate over time if you wear them continuously. And again, you have to do exercise and you have to do it sort of continuously. And so we're really missing that sort of accessible, easy, quick solution that can be used in a doctor's setting and also in a gym with personal trainers, right? So that quick, accurate prediction of the VO2 max.
And what you said is when I'm wearing my device, I could probably get a VO2 max result from my Apple Watch or Whoop or Aura. But how long would I have to wear it to gather enough data for that to be accurate?
So the data differs a bit on that, right? But you will typically say that you have to wear it continuously over several weeks and months before
Okay.
it gets to know you, right? And then in time, it'll be actually a quite sort of good depiction of your VO2 max if you train regularly.
Hmm.
But you have to wear it sort of continuously, right? So not everyone will have sort of a smartwatch or a wearable. So it's that element of sort of it's not really that an accessible solution. It's still a good solution for most people. I also have some of these sort of technologies myself,
I would
but
expect this.
it's still that element of sort of we're missing that sort of really sort of that in clinic perspective that sort of quickly I cannot put on a smartwatch today and then it will provide me my accurate VO2 max right here right now. It would need to get to know me, and then it will provide sort of a decent sort of reading.
I think the consistency bit is actually the dangerous bit. Like, while it makes it more accessible than putting on a mask and going for a stress test in a hospital or an athletic setting. I mean, most people I know struggle with consistency. So then that means that their likelihood of ever getting there is pretty low. Case in point, I forgot to charge my Apple Watch last night, so it's already missing data.
Yeah.
and I know I'm not the only one that's like that. So if you can take away that need for consistency, I'm sure that it improves your accuracy.
No doubt about it.
Now tell this the device that you're offering with Ventriject and what it does and how it works.
Yes. So we basically developed a solution that will give you an accurate VO2 max reading in less than 3 minutes without the use of exercise. So a very unique value proposition out there, right? And how we do that is utilizing two things. So we utilize, first of all, we measure your strength of your heart. We do that utilizing a very small sensor, the size of a matchbox, that we place on the sternum, on the breastbone of a client or a patient. And then it measures the vibrations in the chest caused by the beating heart. And it does that for 40 seconds while you're resting. And during those 40 seconds, we create a really accurate and really detailed expression of your heart and sort of what's happening within your heart and how strong your heart is. We then take that recording and then add that into an algorithm to then calculate your VO2 max, which means that from start to finish, it takes less than 3 minutes. And we can then provide that sort of accurate VO2 max that you can then take action on. So it's really making a really accessible solution. There's no need for exercise. There's no need for wearing a mask or anything. You can do it really fast, right? You can do it in a clinic. You can do it on the gym floor, what have you. It's not need to be done by sort of highly trained sort of physicians. It could be from a physiotherapist, a personal trainer, a cardiologist, nurse, what have you, right? But it's really sort of an accessible solution. Basically, what I actually also referred to is basically we're taking the most accurate, most important indicator of health that's out there and making it accessible as basically taking a blood pressure. And that's what really is needed with VO2 max, right? As we just talked about, it is by far the best indicator for health, right? But most people don't know about it or haven't gotten their VO2 max tested. So we need to have sort of solutions out there to make it much more accessible.
And apples to apples, how does it compare against the stress test? Or, I mean, everybody wants to wear a mask at some point, or maybe not after the pandemic.
No, exactly right. And so if you're looking at sort of the stress test is still the gold standard, and that is will always be the most accurate way of depicting the VO2 max. Right? We've done studies up against that because that is what is seen as the one you want to strive towards. That in itself also has an error rate. Right? It's typically what you see with that gold standard. It has an error rate around sort of 5 to 6%. Looking at our data and the studies that we published with several universities across Europe, is that we will typically have an error rate around 10%, which makes it very close to this gold standard. Again, not saying that we'll match it, but we will make it much more accessible than the gold standard. So we believe that the two can work in combination, basically. The fact that, yes, some people will always need that gold standard with the mask and everything and all the data that provides, but what we need is a much greater audience that actually have their VO2 max testing, and everyone should have their VO2 max tested.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine from a research standpoint, you get a way bigger population to start understanding the impacts, because if the data set right now is really just athletes, sick people, and executives, then there's an opportunity to really accelerate science as well.
Exactly right, and that's also what we're helping sort of research scientists on sort of across the world, right? They're adopting our technology when they're doing large research studies, because now they can actually do that. In the past, it was very difficult or very expensive for them to do.
Right. So, like, who's using Ventriject right now? Like, what are your case studies, your bright spots?
So we offer it in a variety of settings, but I think there's three main areas where we are being used today. One thing is very much within sort of the health assessment or health check world out there, right? That everything from sort of a small health clinic to also a growing market where it's sort of corporate wellness, right? Going an offering for sort of employers that they can actually have sort of providing their staff with sort of a health assessment where VO2 max is a key indicator for that. So that's sort of a really sort of strong part of our customer group today. Then we also are in sort of a sport and fitness world, right, with sport teams, but also fitness centers that really want to talk much more about health and improvements you can do on health. And then lastly, there is that whole sort of clinical research perspective, right, where suddenly they can assess VO2 max much easier and much faster than they could in the past. So they're adding VO2 max into a greater sort of number of studies than they've done in the past. So that's what we've seen sort of across, right? And we have a lot of really good stories on people that sort of, one thing is businesses that really like the fact that people, they can now offer VO2 max in because people wouldn't do sort of the stress test in a corporate setting, but also people that in the past where they said sort of, if you're looking at me, right, so from a BMI perspective, I might be sort of overweight, but looking sort of beneath the skin, and we all know that BMI is actually also a really bad indicator for overall health because it sort of, it tricks the eye. But I actually measured a guy that had sort of a high BMI, and I measured his VO2 max, and he actually had a really good VO2 max because he was sort of training on sort of a biker and stuff like that. But his BMI would typically say he's an overweight guy, but his heart was actually quite strong because he was training, and but there was just some elements that he was still difficulty losing weight, but he was still sort of from a health perspective quite strong.
Well, I think that's good because then you can look at all of these different factors and it's not so black and white as you said. It's your eye would trick you because if you see someone who may not look particularly healthy, they may be healthy because of actions that they're taking, those small actions that can now be measured, right? Very cool. Like, okay.
And it's also actually the opposite way around as well because the other end can also trick you, right? If you're skinny and you might look healthy, but if we always heard about this sort of the fat skinny and the skinny fat, right? And that element of it that you can also trick the eye if you look quite thin, but you're actually not really healthy, right? And that's where sort of with our solution and with VO2 max, you sort of look beneath that and you sort of looking at sort of, okay, but how healthy are you really?
When you talk about the stress test, and I mean, first of all, accessibility is always a barrier, but let's say you could get a stress test and like there is already a little bit of shame about your health conditions in your body. That would be another barrier that would stop people anyway. So I really like that this helps alleviate that and takes the discomfort and potentially shame as a blocker. That's okay. So you said good VO2 max, and then I realized, I mean, of course I can Google good VO2 max and we'll add that to the show notes. But what are you aiming for? What should I be aiming for as a VO2 max?
So it really depends on your gender and your age, right? So there's a very normal sort of slightly drop with age, right? And also with sort of men typically have a slightly higher VO2 max than women. So it really depends on your age group, right? But typically we would say that a VO2 max in sort of for an average sort of 40-year-old, right? It would be sort of if you are sort of that 35 to 40 on the VO2 max scale and above that, that's good, right? So one is sort of you above that. But again, if you're 70-year-old women that come to me, I would have different expectations on where your VO2 max should be at. So it really depends, and that's also what we're trying to guide our customers on and our customers' patients is sort of where you're at versus your peer group, right? So because that's where it's important. But even more importantly, it's actually tracking your development. So one thing is knowing your VO2 max today, but it's important to see, so how does that look a year from now, right? Have you actually improved your VO2 max, or have you stayed, or has it dropped significantly, right? Because that's where it becomes important. So it's even more important to look at sort of comparing up against yourself.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Is you as your own benchmark.
Exactly.
That's always the best thing to compare to, I think.
Exactly.
So let's talk about we're getting to my favorite questions in the podcast, and it's about like dream collaboration. So if you could work with any company to help you scale Ventriject's impact, who would that be and why?
Oh, it's a really good question, Jennifer, right? And for us it's really sort of how can we get VO2 max out to a much greater audience, to a much greater population. So for us, it's sort of love to partner up with people that sort of organizations that sort of are sort of advocates for VO2 max and advocates for health, right? So as American Heart Association, for example, went out and they had a statement paper saying that it is by far the best indicator for health. I would love to have that sort of close collaboration with sort of the heart associations across the world, but also organizations within sort of the health and also within fitness and sports, right? Sort of that touches a lot of people today and are sort of big advocates for overall health, right? And then really sort of being an advocate much more for VO2 max. I don't necessarily need people to push my product. That's great if they do, but actually I would rather want that much more strong conversation on VO2 max and why VO2 max is important, because then I believe I have by far one of the best products out there, and it will almost sell itself. But we need people to talk about the importance of VO2 max and why you should get it tested at least once a year, right? So that's the conversation that we need to have get going.
The general awareness, and I think again, it's because it hasn't been accessible to everyone, and because the lingo is not really understood, I think, by the general population. That's a bridge that definitely needs to be built.
Exactly right, and we need all sort of general practitioners to be able to assess VO2 max when they have sort of patients in the door, right, on a day-to-day basis. It needs to be part of sort of their regular sort of checkups. So in order to do that, we need to have solutions that can enable that, which we have today. But we also need that, as you mentioned, that much greater understanding and that sort of that advocacy on the importance of VO2 max and why you should have that, and really need to be much more sort of actionable when it comes to preventive healthcare. So we talk a lot about how we can prevent diseases. We don't necessarily always invest a lot in it, but so we need to do much more of that, right? We need to also talk much more about sort of what can all businesses do, right? Anything from a corporate setting to sort of healthcare organizations. What can we all do to help people live healthier?
I mean, I think that the corporate well-being has such a role. It's very understated, right? Because this is the environment where you're sitting 8 to 10 hours a day. So the activity and the need for awareness for what you can do to manage all of those lifestyle pillars has to be, I don't know, pushed from within and normalized from within. Because if it's not okay from a work culture standpoint to get up from your desk, to book a walk, to take a walking meeting, then it's really hard for someone to change from within.
Yes.
Okay, I have a wild card question. If you had 10 million euros to invest in a startup that's not your own, where would you, and this is always the thing when I'm speaking to founders. So they're like, but it's mine. Can I just reinvest it in mine? You can't reinvest it in your own. Where would you put the money and why?
That's a really good question. I think so. If you're not looking at my own, right? I think
That's the
that
hardest.
looking at, I think we're seeing a much sort of a growing sort of startup healthcare when it comes to mental health. And I think we can do much more on that. There's some great sort of technologies out there that can do a great deal when it comes to sort of handling mental health, both sort of on the lower end, sort of smaller sort of anxiety and depression, but also on the high end when it comes to schizophrenia and stuff like that. So there's definitely sort of some really cool technologies I've seen out there when it comes to also VR and stuff like that. So I would definitely throw my money at that, right? Because I think that we're seeing some cool things coming out, but I think that it can also have a massive impact when it comes to health.
Immersive technology for mental health.
Yes.
Very interesting. Very cool. Thank you. So now we can sling some mud if we want to. So the longevity space is really booming right now, and it feels like a little bit of a gold rush, which basically means that there is a whole lot of snake oil at the moment. I'm curious about what scares you the most, or what you're most skeptical about that's maybe getting the most airtime in the longevity category.
Well, first of all, generally I see a lot of positive things about longevity. The fact that people want to do things to sort of live longer, to live healthier, that's really a great thing. We need to make it much more accessible on things. So it's not only for the millionaires, but it's for all of us that can do things. That said, you're right, there are definitely things to be sort of cautious on. I think generally I don't have a sort of thing where people are offering quick fixes on stuff. I can barely take that serious, right? There's really when it comes to health, there's not a lot of quick fixes, especially when it comes to sort of overall sort of longevity and things, right? It takes time to change things. It takes time to improve your VO2 max. Takes time to improve your overall health. However, if you do it, yes, you can actually really have a sort of a significant impact to your health. But it's not just take this supplement and then you'll be great tomorrow. That's not how life works, right?
The take a pill promise.
Exactly, right. So I don't like the quick fixes of the longevity wave. I like sort of the fact that the things that we sort of some supplements make sense, right? Also on the longer term, right? You can actually see an impact on the longer term, but the ones that are offering just this quick fix, this quick pill, and then you'll be sort of golden. That's where I see sort of a lot of the snake oil, the caveats that you should be aware of. But overall, there's really a lot of cool stuff coming out there. But also what we're really trying to push from a Ventriject perspective is really that focus on sort of evidence-based approach. Right? So we pride ourselves in being sort of science-driven, right? We're a spin out of a university. I have a chief cardiologist and a cardiology professor as part of my founding team. So we really strive ourselves in continuously doing more research and really backing our claims up with science. And we're publishing our papers in peer-reviewed journals. So that's sort of really what we strive on, and I hope other businesses will do the same, because then we can sort of cut through the noise and saying, okay, sort of what are the technologies and the methods that can actually improve health, and then what are some more of the snake oils out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I am drawing from what you're saying, and particularly like you saying supplements, you're not the first person who said it. I think it's everybody that has been on the longevity podcast is like, be careful about supplements, because if you can't measure it, you can't claim it, right? It's like, how do you know you're making a positive impact unless there's some sort of indicator other than the feeling, the qualitative thing, because it could be placebo effect. So it's, and on the flip side, if you don't know how things are going to interact with your system, it could be the opposite of what you aim to gain, right? So good call out there. And there's definitely a theme that's emerging. Are there any individuals, companies, movements in the longevity or health space that you'd like to give a shout out to?
No, that's really a good question, right? I want to give a shout out to generally sort of these sort of fitness centers in general that is moving away from just being sort of, let's offer you sort of, there's weights over here, there's sort of the cardio exercise bikes over here, but moving into much more that health and wellness being, right? I think that's really an interesting trend that we would love to support much more, right? That we see the gym space is much more than just we want to build muscle or we want to lose weight, but it's really sort of catering towards our health. So we have some great partners there, but I also see sort of it's a booming environment, and I think that's really sort of, I want to continuously push on that. And then I really just want to give a shout out to all businesses that are trying to support their staff in being more well-being, right? And how we can support people of living healthier. I think that's a sort of a growing role as a company. You need to look at that, right? You need to see how you can make your staff live healthier, live much more well than they do.
100%, because then they can fulfill their impact for themselves, for the company, for the world, et cetera, and we'll all live happily ever after. Well, thank you so much for your thoughts, for your contributions, for the work that you're doing with Ventriject. I've really enjoyed our discussion today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Connecting the Dots. If today sparked a new idea, helped shift your thinking, or gave you something to take forward, share it, rate the show, or drop us a message. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next conversation. Until then, keep connecting the dots that matter.